Hit it.
Hello, Calvin parents and families. My name is Rick Shore, and I serve Calvin University as the Director of Alumni and Parent Relations. And we're so glad to have you here on what is the first, and we hope to be a series of Calvin Chats, to sort of give you an update on what life is like at Calvin right now, especially as it's Parent and Family Weekend, or Family Week, I should say. And unfortunately, we can't invite you on campus. So we wanted to give you a peek into what life is like for your students right now. And we are so pleased to have with us today Dr. Sarah Visser, who is the Vice President for Student Life and the co-chair of the COVID response team, and John Whitty, who is the Dean of Students. We're so glad to have them here. We've gotten a bunch of questions already from our Parent Council members. Our Parent Council represents you, our parents and families, to the Calvin administration to talk about concerns that are needing to be addressed for families, and also just to provide some guidance and also help encourage our faculty and staff as we move forward in this new era. So John and Sarah, welcome. It's been a month since students have moved in, and we're entering week 5 of classes. How are you and your team doing? I know it's been a little crazy.
Uh, Crazy but fun. So first of all, thanks for having us, Rick, and thank you to the parents and family members who are joining. We're really grateful for your engagement. One of the things that has been so encouraging to me over the last months is the ways that our parents and families have surrounded us, not only with prayer, but also with encouragement. Your questions have helped refine the work that we're doing and our response to and care for students. So thank you for that. Let me say that first off. In terms of how we're feeling, I'd say I think probably about a week ago was the first time where some of us started to exhale, not because we think we're out of the woods, but because we had a chance to catch a breath and look around and say, hey, this is going okay so far. We have been really, really encouraged by the ways that students and faculty and staff have come together and responded well. This is a year unlike any other in the history of higher education, let alone in each of our careers. And so I think we've been really encouraged by the response that we've had. Our students are so gracious. They're compliant. As I chat with other colleagues at other institutions, I'm always encouraged when I hear about some of the things they're navigating. And I think, wow, our Calvin students, for the most part, really, really want to be here and are keenly focused on doing this right and doing this well and loving their neighbors well, as we say often on campus. Having said all that, the team is tired. It's been a long 6 months, and it has been kind of a relentless slew of new curveballs and new changes and new things to acclimate to. But we remain really hopeful. So I find myself a little amazed that it's almost October, but also feeling like, hey, look at that, it's almost October. So really encouraged. And I'm sure John has more to chime in.
I could say I echo what Sarah just said. Ditto to that. It's been 4 full weeks of classes. We're in the 5th week now. But some of us were welcoming students back weeks prior to that with RAs on campus and some student leadership showing up early. And then going back into the summer, just all the work that was done to plan. And when you plan that far in advance in a situation like this, you're planning for the unknown in many ways. You can make plans, but it's not until people get here and feet are on the ground and students are sleeping in residence halls that you realize where you need to plan further or where your plans weren't enough. I would just find it. I'd say it was hard to anticipate everything that needed to be anticipated. But it does feel really good. The analogy I gave a few people was for the first 2 weeks, I felt like there was a tide coming in toward me of work and worry and sicknesses and what is happening and will we make it, like other schools that we were seeing, of course, in the media there were some bad examples. But then the tide started going the other direction, and I am standing on some dry ground right now and feeling okay about that.
Yeah, that's a good place to be. And I know we've got a COVID dashboard that is updated every day. I looked at it this morning, and I think there were maybe 5 active cases and maybe a cumulative of 44 over when we started testing back in August. So that's great. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the number of people who've been exposed or in quarantine but didn't test positive. What exactly do all these numbers mean, and how is Calvin doing?
Yeah, well, so thanks for the reference to the dashboard. That has become a really helpful pointer for a lot of parents, families, and other folks who are external constituents of the university. So I never pass up a chance to help clarify what the difference is between things like isolation and quarantine. Folks who are in isolation are those who have been confirmed positive cases of COVID, while those who are in quarantine are folks who have been confirmed close contacts. We have another third category of folks that we refer to as PUI, so persons under investigation, and those are people who are symptomatic, not feeling well, who report that through the Campus Clear app, which is our symptom tracker. And so we're keeping, as a student life team, we're keeping a close eye on all three of those categories. So Rick, you did reference that dashboard updates every 24 hours. And one of the things I can note is that it usually updates pretty early in the morning. Sometimes with our network system, there's a bit of a lag. So you might say, if you're watching it like a hawk, you might see that the data actually updates around 9 or 10. But when it does, it might say updated at 7:30, and you'll think that's not when it actually updated. It's just our system catching up with itself. But this morning, case in point, we were showing that we had 4 student cases and 1 active employee case. I know that in the time between when that was updated and now, we've actually had 2 of those students who have completed their isolation. So that number will change in the next 24 hours. So we always get excited when we see students roll off the dashboard into the recovered category. We spend a lot of time in prayer and energy supporting those students, so it's always a small victory. On the quarantine side, I checked this morning, and just before we started, we were at about 18 students. There were about 5 on campus, 13 off campus. So again, those would be students who were confirmed close contacts. And Kent County Health Department, which is a close partner of ours, they have very stringent ways of looking at that. So we fielded a lot of calls from students who say, I know somebody, I'm in a class with somebody who I think might be positive. Does that make me a close contact? And the truth is, if you are a close contact, you will be told by the Kent County Health Department, and actually we have 2 internal Calvin staff members who are kind of delegated with those responsibilities. So we have internal contact tracers who reach out to those individuals. So currently we have 18 of those, which is actually good news for us as well. I think at the high point we had many, many more. And you heard John reference when we all felt like the tide was coming in and we were kind of gasping for breath, hoping that it wasn't going to keep coming in. And that was the time when we had a lot of students in quarantine. What was encouraging to us is that even at that high point, we were nowhere near maxing out our capacity for housing on campus. So if you remember from communications and other conversations we've had, we had set aside a residence hall that was available for students, whether they needed to be isolated because they're confirmed cases or quarantined because they were close contacts, or if they're just symptomatic students who are either awaiting testing results or perhaps they're monitoring symptoms in consultation with our health services team to see if it develops into anything else. So that too was good news for us, that even at what we would say was our high point or our peak a week or 2 back, we still had ample space. And we've got lots of other spaces up our sleeves, so to speak, if we needed to expand beyond what we have set aside. So all in all, I hope that kind of gets at the questions you were raising, but we're feeling optimistic and encouraged.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm so happy to hear that. And it's been reassuring too, because I think, when we're going through the summer, we're like, oh, we'll be lucky if we can last a couple weeks, and you see that God is faithful and all our planning is paying off. And we're so grateful to the students who are taking it so seriously, and it's a real gift. So
can I add something there, Rick?
Yeah, sure.
Of the maybe 114 students who have been at some point this fall in quarantine, we saw very little spread of the virus once a student was in quarantine. And that's one of the, where there was any concern about like, oh, this is going to balloon out in some exponential way, it didn't happen because of isolation and quarantine practices. They're working, and we have not seen anybody who was a close contact because they're in a class with another student. Things like masks and distancing in classrooms are working. So all the things that we put into place to help and I'm sure we're not even doing it perfectly, but we're doing a very good job and our students are complying with it. Those things work. So when we've had some cases, they've been person-to-person contacts amongst friends or amongst people who live together in a suite. And that's in some ways predictable and not horribly surprising, but it's also been controlled by quarantine and isolation.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that parents have been wondering is, besides all those things that we already have in place that we've talked about, is there additional surveillance going on, and like some randomized testing and those types of things that are happening on campus?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you remember, we did almost 4,000 tests, screening tests, I should say, as students were welcoming back for the new academic year. And in fact, we have been doing some ongoing surveillance testing. We've started that process with our student athletes. So there's a weekly randomized testing that's happening each week. In the next couple of weeks, we'll roll in some other student groups into that. So in particular, we're starting to look at who are the students who are engaging in community work. So we have lots of students who have an internship or some stated academic reason they need to be in the community. And so we want to think about how we would surveil them. We're also thinking about our on-campus residents because, as John referenced, we know that we're doing a pretty good job of quarantining and isolation in a way that we can limit the spread and exposure. But we'd also like to keep tabs on, are there hotspots on campus and how can we help mitigate that? So you can stay tuned. There'll be more and more of that coming out. One of the things we're eager for, and we think we're maybe within the month, though these things change all the time, we're eager to see easier ways to test. And by that, I mean, we think we're pretty close to having access to what we affectionately refer to as spit tests. So rather than doing those nasal swabs, we know that the technology is evolving and that soon it's almost like a home pregnancy test. You'll be able to spit on something and within 15, 20 minutes, you'll have an indication of whether or not there is virus present. So we're eager for that. We're working closely with Helix Diagnostics, which is our partner, and we know that we'll have access to that just as soon as they do. So I think that'll also help us increase some of our surveillance testing capacity.
Yeah, that's great. And I know students and faculty and staff have to fill out their Campus Clear app every day. Like I filled out mine. I got my little green check this morning. And so what happens if they indicate on the app that they've got a symptom or something? What are the next steps?
I love that we're all doing it. I would have to put in my code to pull it up, but I too did the Campus Clear app today. John, I wonder if you could walk through what the steps are. I'll just say as context, there's a pretty intricate system, a web of care behind that app. It's not just fun and games. It actually is the thing that helps us respond quickly, efficiently, and with tailored care. So John, maybe walk us through the steps of that.
Yeah, there are a few ways we hear about students who are ill. But the Campus Clear app is a pretty reliable one, and I'd say the vast majority of students are using it, mostly regularly. I would be lying if I say I haven't forgotten or done it a little later in the morning. But it's a good practice and a good reminder. And so if a student indicates on the Campus Clear app one symptom, maybe in a certain list of ones that are a little bit more minor, they're probably going to get a call. And asked to not go to class that day just to see how the symptoms develop. If that goes away, they're probably fine. And if there's something to be concerned about and there's another one or it continues and the next day there's another symptom or two, then this is all sort of scripted out based on some protocols from the health department and from our health services staff. Then those students would be further talked to by staff here. They'd have an appointment, a virtual appointment. And maybe they'd be asked to stay away from class even longer. They'd be put on the PUI list, the person under investigation. And we'd probably sign them up for testing. So we continue that testing, both screening and diagnostic, every day. Every morning, the Helix staff is here. Decline. And that's funny. How do you not answer your phone when you're in a live event? I'll figure that out. So that testing is done every day, and we get the results back usually within 48 hours. And then a student could be actually confirmed, or more likely, to be honest with you, 90% of the people are confirmed as not COVID positive, and there's an alternative diagnosis that makes the most sense. So that's the way we've been doing it. The Campus Clear Up has been key in that, and several people are involved depending on how students answer the questions on that form. Anything else you wanted to add, Sarah?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great explanation. The one thing I'd say, as we've been thinking about a plan for surveillance testing, we've heard from several experts in the field. And one of the things that they've let us know is that symptomology is actually our best bet here. So, we're doing surveillance testing because we do want to be able to track any asymptomatic carriers, but the percentage of asymptomatic carriers is so low that actually they would say symptomology is your best bet. The more accurately people report symptoms when they have them, it doesn't necessarily mean they have COVID, but what it allows us to do is to put in place all of the systems of support we have, right? So we can isolate those students or contain it so that we know that there's not spread until we can rule out COVID and figure out an alternative diagnosis. We just continue to urge people to fill out that Campus Clear app. So if you've talked to your students, you'll know that we're starting to do incentivizing of that, right? So Student Senate is awarding prizes and rewards for people who are filling that out accurately. And they're probably sick of us talking about it because we talk about it all the time. We're trying to put together little videos to remind people. Really, we're hoping that it just becomes part of the cadence of everyday life. And that's true, again, for students, staff, and all faculty.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about parents want to know what actually does happen if a student has to go into quarantine. And so what's life like for them? How are we caring well for their students?
Go ahead, John.
I could answer that, I think. I've had a number of conversations with students who are going into either isolation or quarantine, depending on the situation, as have a bunch of staff members in residence life, and who I'm really grateful for their work and their partnership. So usually when we identify a student who tests positive, we're making a room available for them in a residence hall that's unoccupied this year that we've reserved just for this purpose. And we have rooms made up with linens and towels and some goodies. We set a key out for them. And if they need help moving, we can do that. Almost in every situation, the students are well enough to grab a duffel bag and pack a few things. And then when they get settled, they'll get a call from a staff member here is a bit like a social worker for our students who are in isolation and quarantine, who's checking in on them. She has a team of students who working with her, who are also doing some of that follow-up and dropping things off and checking in on them. We have academic services staff, student success staff who check in with students on notifying the professors about studying remotely for a while. So a lot of those things happen. Now, a similar thing happens when a student is put into quarantine. Those are students who have had contact with a positive case, so they're usually not ill, and they're probably not even under investigation at this point, but they get a call that says, you've had contact. You might have to relocate. So depending on the situation in their suite or their apartment or where they live off campus, they might have to relocate. So for a student on campus, if they have a roommate and maybe both of them have to quarantine, they do have to quarantine in separate spaces so that if one of them gets ill, the other one might not. So as soon as possible, we'll provide a suite or a room for each of them, usually in that vacant residence hall, sometimes right in their same residence hall where they live. So students in quarantine also have some of that same contact with academics staff and our health services staff if needed, but also the social worker, Kelsey Colburn, who's been doing a fantastic job. Those folks have a little bit more freedom to move about than a student who would be in isolation. So a student who's in quarantine, just to set the record straight, if they're not having any symptoms at all, they do need to stay in their room and not share, not like if they share a bathroom very carefully, they can do that. They can go get their own food in the dining hall if they're wearing a mask. They can go out for a walk. They can do a number of things outside, but they can't really be in large groups. They can't be inside buildings like a residence hall, basement, or study room, or classrooms. We're asking them to study remotely for that period of time that they're in quarantine. And that almost always lasts for 14 days from the date that they had contact with a positive case. And that's a long time. 14 days is a long time. So particularly for a student who might be alone in a suite somewhere, we know that this is not a great situation. It's not perfect. So there are a number of things we're trying to do to follow up with them and offer support, particularly when they're not symptomatic, to get them outside and walking and at least seeing some other people, and creating some mental health kind of supports through our counseling office. These have been important things. So not going to lie that quarantine is just a great time of watching Netflix and doing your homework. It can be a little lonely at times, but and students are finding various ways to cope, and we're learning along with them about what ways we can best support them in that.
That's great.
Yeah, maybe I'll just chime in and say we have had some questions from students and family members who say, well, okay, so if my student is in quarantine, if they were to get tested, couldn't you test them once or even twice? And then if they're negative, couldn't they just be released from quarantine?
Right.
And unfortunately, County Health Department, due to their protocols and the guidance that they give us and the expectations we have, that 14 days really is a hard line. And the reason for that is because an individual who's exposed to somebody who is COVID positive could develop those symptoms, could develop kind of that viral caseload as far off as 14 days from that date of exposure. So for instance, if they were to take a negative test and then 2 days later they were negative again, we couldn't just say, oh, it's official, they're never going to develop that. So that does
Correct.
explain that 2-week quarantine period. And like John said, that's a long time. I think what we've learned through this, and some of this has come from family members, I think we continually are trying to refine how we support those students, how we come alongside them. Just a week or so ago, we were able to hire a cadre of social work interns, so our own Kelvin students who are working closely with contact tracers, and you heard our social worker, Kelsey Colburn. Their whole job, their whole purpose is to check in with students, those who are quarantined, those who are isolated, just to make sure that they're doing okay, because that's the piece of it, that they just feel so apart from everything else that's happening.
Yep.
And there's a lot of good work happening too on the residence life side. So RAs and floors, we're finding that they're finding some creative ways to remain linked with people while they're away during those time periods. And then I also wanted to put in a plug for a new app that Kelvin just unveiled last week, and this is coming from the Center for Counseling and Wellness. It has a bit of an unfortunate name in the midst of a pandemic, but the name was in place even before COVID-19 was around. So the app is called Unmasked. In fact, we want students to remain masked while they're on campus, but Unmasked is an app that invites students to connect with their peers, and it's anonymous. So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, students could get on. And I know John and I received some anonymous updates from our director of our Center for Counseling and Wellness, where she shared some examples, again, anonymously, of the kinds of encouragement that students were offering to each other. And we do have students who are part of our student advisory board for our Center for Counseling and Wellness who help oversee that. But what an encouragement to see students reaching out, but also to see students comforting and encouraging one another. So there was a lot of like, I get it, I've been there, it gets better. Here's some tips. Are you connecting in these ways? And often we find that that's a really great on-ramp for lots of the programming that continues to happen through the Center for Counseling and Wellness. So we continue to offer virtual counseling. There are workshops and groups. There are all kinds of ways to stay plugged in, just as if it were a normal year, except they're also available remotely. So that's really helpful.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole Kelvin chat just on what's available from the Wellness Center. So
yes,
there's a lot of good stuff happening there. So Johnny talked a little bit about isolation and quarantine and spoke a lot about what's happening on campus and where they go on campus. Is there anything different with the commuter students or with off-campus students that you'd want to mention?
Sure. Yeah, and I didn't mean to not mention them. I'm less involved in that, and that's partly because commuter students are pretty self-sufficient. One of the reasons they probably choose to live off campus in some ways. I've had a lot of communication with them since back in August, where I asked them to think about what it will be like if one of them living in their house or their apartment or their duplex has to be in quarantine or has to be in isolation. And we actually encouraged them to have a COVID conversation to talk about what that will look like, how they'll support each other, how they'll share space, and those kind of things. I don't know how many students actually had an official COVID conversation, but what's happening is that when a student off campus, a commuting student, is identified as a PUI or is in quarantine, they're reporting back that they can have their own bedroom. They're getting clear instructions on how to either share a bathroom in a really good way in terms of sanitation, or to have a bathroom just for them during that time, and then some instructions for those that they live with to give them appropriate space. And there is inherent risk when you live with other people. If one of you is sick, that but it's not unheard of that you could not get ill if you're taking the right kind of precautions. So what we do is, on a case-by-case basis, help those students know how to sanitize well and how to live together well, and then we are relying on them to put that into action with their roommates. And so far, that's been going well. They're able to find that isolation or quarantine space within their own places of residence.
Great. And Sarah, you were mentioning a little bit about people wondering if they could get additional COVID tests. Mm-hmm. And so we're regularly telling students that they do need a COVID test. They need to go to the health services and not go off campus to get that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that is.
Yeah, so first and foremost, we think that it's the most reliable in terms of consistency with turnaround time. You probably have heard us say in the past that Dr. Laura Champion, who's the director of Calvin Health Services, she actually has medical rights through Spectrum Health. So that's a great partner for us. If a student is in touch with health services and requests to have a COVID test, or is asked to have a COVID test by one of our health medical providers, what happens is we do diagnostic testing either through Helix, or on the weekends we're working closely with Spectrum Health. And because of our affiliations and close contact with them, we're able to get those results in a really timely way. And so we have consistently been tracking ahead of external sources in terms of the turnaround time for those tests. The other thing that's great about it is, because of our conversations and connections with Kent County Health Department, we're able to kind of jump to the front of the line in terms of the support that we get from the health department as well. So for students and families, one thing I'd want you to know is that testing through Calvin is virtually free. And that is because any and all COVID tests are covered by insurance. So there is no out-of-pocket cost for the students. So I would say the convenience of it, the ability to get the test results really quickly, which helps mobilize us on the student care side. And I think just that one-on-one tailored conversation with a member of the health services team. Those are all reasons that as a parent, I would see that as the most viable option for testing and for those who need it.
Yeah, that's great. So, okay, so we've talked a lot about sort of managing COVID and testing and all that type of thing, but let's talk a little bit now about student life and what life is actually like for students on campus this semester. I mean, I remember from my freshman year, the first semester of your freshman year is always tough, just trying to meet people and find your community. But this year, there's an extra layer in there. We couldn't do things like chaos night. So what is life like for students right now, and how are they connecting? I know we said things were going to be pretty strict and shut down the first 3 weeks, and we were going to see if we could loosen that up. And so I think we're getting to that point now. And we've also seen the governor change some of her restrictions for the state this past week, which are going to loosen things up even more. So what's happening, and what do you think you're going to be starting to look at?
Yep.
Yeah, well, why don't I give kind of an overview, and then John, maybe you could share some of the more specific ways that we're enacting things on campus. So, yeah, Rick, you hit it. You hit the nail on the head there. When we came back, the first thing we needed to make sure was that our mitigation efforts were proven effective. In fact, that is the phrase that we heard from Kent County Health Department. They said, okay, we're leery of any kind of communal living, any kind of communal activity, but if you put in place these restrictions and work hard to make sure that you're mitigating hazards and risks, then once that's proven effective, then we'll partner with you to turn the dial, if you will. So to dial back those restrictions and help students engage a little bit more of what we know as a normal Calvin experience. So in fact, we've been really pleased on, as a campus and internally with our policies, we see that students are compliant. We see that these mitigation practices are proving effective. So John can say a little bit more about what we've been able to roll out. And as you alluded to, Rick, the governor just this week has announced that there are some the restrictions are even lesser as of October 9th. So this week, the focus of the COVID response team, which is the leadership team that's stewarding this work, our focus is really to say, okay, what does that mean as we think about entering into the next phase of campus life, and how will we live into that as we move forward? But John, maybe you could share a little bit about what we're doing right now, and even how we've started to turn that dial.
Yeah, sure. We did ask, although we've had some tighter rules about visiting people in residence hall rooms and on floors, and in different buildings, actually, we have encouraged RAs and student leaders on floors and in buildings to be thoughtful about some activities, mostly outside kinds of activities, and then some online kinds of things. We've seen examples of all of that. So students, groups going for walks together, floors doing mini golfing or walking to Reed's Lake, getting ice cream out there. Coffee outings are popular. There have been game nights with other floors, lawn games, a beach day, finger painting, going to the thrift store. I don't know what that was about. Trivia nights, painting outside, pickleball, fishing at the campus pond. I would not eat those fish. Origami, coloring, movie nights. We've had a few all-campus activities as well. We showed a movie on the Commons lawn last weekend. Had two showing, actually ended up going down to one showing, and it really wasn't that well attended. And maybe it was the movie we were showing, but the students that went, I think, had a good time sitting out on the lawn watching an outdoor movie. I know the German department had a German film night outside, and that went really well. This past weekend, we had a comedian do two shows, Friday and Saturday, and I think sold out both of them. That was an outdoor show. And as we look to sort of an opening up in a couple weeks, based on the governor's executive order, we think that occupancy in some of our indoor spaces will change. So spaces like residence hall basements, which have been limited to 10 people, which is hard, that fills up quickly. That'll change based on square footage, and that'll give students a little bit more breathing room, especially as the weather changes, to associate in small groups with each other, with masks and distancing and all these things that we're getting used to. But we just this weekend allowed students who live on the same floor to visit inside each other's rooms in the apartments and also in the residence halls within certain limits, occupancy limits, and still distancing and wearing masks and leaving doors open. But it was the first change we've had in visiting since we started, and I think it was appreciated. And we could see that continuing in a couple more weeks, particularly with the governor's changes, where we might allow students from other halls to visit, or other floors to visit within some limited capacity too. So we started to allow students from other residence halls to visit each other's basements. That was one of the other changes this past weekend. So it's slower than I think anybody wants, including us. There is nothing that residence life professionals want more than to allow for community to develop. We don't as much create community as we allow it to develop in healthy ways based on things that we set up for students. We've not been able to set things up in the same ways this year, and we know that's been a challenge. And at the same time, students are stepping into that with creative ideas, and we knew that they would do that.
Yeah, that's great. So can you talk a little bit about how students are accessing things like the library or the fitness center? And how is worshiping happening on campus right now?
Yeah, well, why don't I pick up with worship, and then John, maybe you can say a little bit more about the fitness center and the library. So worship, as you may remember, we're doing it all virtually this year, And we're still hosting chapels 5 days a week. What I can tell you is that we're tracking those numbers. It's a little bit more difficult to track than it normally would be, where you can kind of count bodies in seats and say, oh, this is how many people are attending. Instead, what we're tracking are screens. So meaning who is viewing this, who is in the moment either watching it or watching it later. And on average, we're seeing that there are about 200 daily screens or viewers. Now, that may actually be far more than 200. Part of that is because we've opened up different rooms around campus as chapel viewing rooms. Those rooms have a monitor that's a part of our volunteer chapel staff, and they're streaming it in there, but it's a way for people to congregate and to have some fellowship and to worship, together in place. Pastor Mary Holst is preaching every Wednesday. And so, for example, last Wednesday, there were 360 viewers. So, we know that people are engaging that. Like John said earlier, none of us loves the way that we have to do things this year. It's not, Calvin is known for its embodied education, and that pertains both to the classroom and also to the co-curricular. But we've been really encouraged by the ways that students, staff, and faculty are leaning in and finding new ways to connect. And in fact, we've also received a fair amount of feedback that families and other Calvin affiliates external to campus right now are grateful for the ways that they can chime in and that they're able to engage in that corporate worship as well. So, we continue to refine and think through what are the ways that we can do more. This morning's chapel was a prayer vigil on the lawn, and there were several hundred people who were spaced out and prayed together. So I think that's an example, again, of we're trying to live within the constraints that we have, and in the midst of that, we really see God's faithfulness.
Yeah, that's so true. And I know it's really true about other people wanting to watch the worship services. And my mom has been watching chapel services too, and she'll text me. She's like, "Hey, did you see Pastor Mary's message today?" And so
that's great.
I know others off campus are really appreciating it as well. Excuse me. So John, what else is happening with things like the library and the fitness center?
Yeah, the library currently is open for or open for business, but on an unlimited basis. I think they actually still only have one floor open. Is that Sarah? Yep. For studying, and that there's stations that students can book ahead of time, and it's actually not typically full. So students are finding places to camp out or study or go back to where they live and study there. But there is a plan for the library as things continue to open and mitigation efforts show that they're working to open up additional floors. I expect that with the weather changing, the demand for some of that study space will increase, and we'll be ready for that. Pete's Coffee Shop is open. I had my coffee this morning. It's different, but I talked to the staff there, and they still do have their little rushes where people come in to get their coffee or drinks, and that's been positive. The fitness center, since that opened within the last couple weeks, I think I don't know the numbers. I know that it's being used because we've had some conversations about masks when you're using exercise equipment. So that's come up as a question. So there's definitely people utilizing that space. There's a bunch of intramural activities going on, all sort of different, changed, fitting the context. And some of those had a slower start, and then they're starting to build up steam. I think I have noticed students taking a cautious approach to like getting engaged in new things. Just like we are being cautious about opening them up, they're being cautious in jumping right in. And I think that's fitting. Like in some ways, it's like we've said, it's not ideal, but when they know they have their safe space in their room. They know the few things that they can do regularly. They have, if they're commuting, they have space off campus where they can go. And then they start to bring in these new elements and opportunities into their daily routines. So I think that will continue to grow and hopefully grow in safe ways. The climbing wall has jumped right back up there in popularity as that's opened. And I think indoor recreation, things like basketball and volleyball in a distanced or at least a less dense kind of way is going to be popular and is already picking up steam.
Yeah, that's great. So what about music ensembles? I know I think Capella was singing at chapel last week. So I know that they're practicing, but are they able to do performances this fall?
Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of performances are going to happen virtually. And we're having a lot of conversations about that right now, particularly with the academic division and some of those music ensembles. That's one of those areas that we've appreciated our partnership with Kent County Health Department. So you can imagine anything that's not just cut and dry, this is exactly how it fits the guidance. We've really partnered with them to say, well, what if we try this? And this is our mitigation plan. And does this seem like it could work? All of those ensembles are rehearsing. And one example is the Lessons and Carols service. This is something that is a beloved Calvin tradition. It happens during the Advent season each year. And we know that this is going to be a virtual event for the first time this year. What's great about that is that it'll invite many other folks to participate who perhaps aren't local or in close proximity to West Michigan. So yes, ensembles are happening. It tends to be in smaller groups. And they have all kinds of mitigation policies in place in terms of how they need to space and the masks they wear and how they can engage one another. The same is true of our performance clubs and organizations. So we're seeing more and more of our student orgs request permission to meet, to assemble in small groups in safe ways as they think about what it looks like to engage in kind of that co-curricular student experience as well. So we're encouraged. That's another part of the dial that we're slowly turning in collaboration with all of our partners.
Yeah, that's great. And like we've already alluded to, the governor made some executive orders last week that are going to change some of these requirements on October 9. So I think it's going to be, I think right now we're at, you can have 10 people at indoor gatherings and 100 people at outdoor gatherings. And then with seating capacity on October 9, we're going to move those limits to 20 people per 1,000 square feet indoors, or 20% of the seating capacity. And then slightly higher numbers for outdoor gatherings. So they'll be helpful for weekend programming. I know there'll be some things that are going to be changing. And I also just want to put a plug in for homecoming and family weekend that's happening this week. So we have a lot of great activities that are going to be virtual and things for families to participate in as well. So those are all online at kelvin.edu/homecoming. There's a whole calendar of what is going to be available. So we encourage you to take advantage of it. There's even some trivia nights for families as well. And I know we've been working with the city to try to get some fire pits on campus so students can also enjoy an outdoor bonfire. So we're hopeful that will be a change that will be coming from the city as well. Are there any other student activities or things that you guys would like to mention or highlight coming up?
I think John plugged quite a few of them.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, we're excited. I think you'll see intramurals and all of those things again start to roll out even more. So we're chomping at the bit ourselves, ready to do all that.
Great. And so the big question is, what happens when it gets cold out? So we know a lot of students right now are eating outdoors. What are some of the plans for moving things indoors a little bit, or how are we going to deal with the changing temperatures in Michigan?
I know, you mean it doesn't stay warm here all year round, but oh, how we wish it did. Yeah, we've been given a lot of thought to that. We know that that's a big concern for all of our students and for staff and faculty as well. So, the governor's new executive order does help us because it gives us some creative ways to think about capacity and density of spaces on campus. One of the things that we've been particularly dialed in on in the last week or so is commuter student spaces, in particular spaces for commuter students to eat on campus. So John, I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the work you've been engaging with our facility staff and with our dining staff to try to identify some of those locations for students.
Yeah, definitely. So working with the Kent County Health Department has been really positive for us, but they do consider us differently than, say, a restaurant, and so some of our food serving practices and things like that follow certain protocols that feel like a little tighter than maybe students feel if they were to go off campus. But they've been safe, and that's because we have this residential community that lives and eats and works and learns together in such tight quarters. So what we did is identify 4 spaces, since commuting students don't typically go in the dining halls unless they have a meal plan and seating there is limited. they'll buy food at Johnny's Snack Shop, which has been doing well. They've been doing some good sales, but students bring their own food in as well. Where do they eat between classes? Well, we identified 4 places that we felt the health department would consider safe because they're not sort of on the walkways, or they're not part of a thoroughfare of people. They could be separated a bit from the walkway. And with the right staffing to sanitize tables in between or regularly during a certain time when people could eat, we felt like we could do that safely. So we did get their feedback on that, and although they didn't, well, how do I say that? That there wasn't approval needed. It was just like they liked our plans, and so we're going to go forward with them, starting as soon as we're able to get the tables in place and the staffing to wipe those tables, and I'd expect that to happen in the middle of this week. So commuters will have 4 pretty logical and central locations where they can go and eat safely, in addition to what some of them are doing, which is eating, in between classes when they run home, or on days they're not here on campus for whatever reason. So some of those things are just adapting. Students are finding places. I've seen them just sitting and studying in little quiet nooks of hallways and the overpass, and actually sometimes cozy looking little places where they can enjoy their time between classes. So we've been thinking about that a lot, and maybe the governor's orders will allow us to increase capacity inside the dining halls a bit too, but we'll wait to see on that. They have not been full. The dining halls have not been full inside, but they're starting to now. That, like, today is one of the first rainy days here in Grand Rapids that I can remember since move-in, which has been a blessing in many ways. But so this is the kind of week where we'll start to now see how we transition and move into the new reality. Students are creative and helpful and making suggestions, and we'll hopefully move forward on those 4 areas for commuters.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks, John. And I know, speaking of dining, there's been a lot of challenges with that this year, just trying to figure out how to deliver food in this whole new system. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of summarize some of those changes, and also like what may be coming down the road as far as food services concerned.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about the reality, and then I would think we would love to invite our food service director here from Creative Dining, Scott Vanderay, to come and do a chat with families, because I think it's a big enough topic that you could probably fill a longer period of time with this. Obviously, our food has needed to it's needed to be delivered differently, both in the way it's served and the way that it's taken by the person eating and where they eat. That's led to styrofoam and to-go bags and all that stuff that we've gotten good at. One of the early concerns were just the lines, as both the staff needed to get used to how to serve this in an efficient way, and also as they built up the number of staff, a lot of folks in our food service area lost their positions last spring when the college went all online. So there's been a process of bringing people back, hiring student workers. That's going well. So as the staffing is increased and their level of efficiency has gotten better, they've learned that. The other thing that's really helped with lines is that students know when to go eat. We even in a normal year, you would have really long lines at certain times of the day, like 5 o'clock. Everyone wants to eat dinner at 5 o'clock, so the lines were extremely long at 5 o'clock, even before COVID. So now students are learning that if they come maybe at a sort of a less traditional time, that there's likely to be no line. I grabbed a little food for lunch today, and there was 0 line at Commons line 2. But I came at the right time, and it was at 10 till noon, so it was not an odd time to eat lunch either. So students are learning practices that make those lines shorter. They're learning what's available. The food service folks have done a lot of interviewing of students to find out what kind of foods they want. Now they're offering different menus at both dining halls, so students can check the online menus and see where they want to eat. It's not just the same food at all the locations, so there's some choice being introduced. There's lots of grab and go things when you go through the line, so you can point at what you want and take that with you. So that's been going well too, and they're serving more of the comfort food kinds of things that students have been asking for. I expect that the menu will continue to change and I'll say get better or get more complete as we continue with the staffing and getting used to things. And that's where I think it would be great to have Scott here to speak a little bit more to that.
Yep, that's a great idea. We can definitely work to make that happen in the weeks ahead. So shifting topics a little bit, we know that beginning of October, we're going to have a couple break days coming up. And so what's sort of expected for students then? Are you encouraging them to stay on campus, or what advice can we give to parents to encourage their students during those times?
Yeah, so I know that, this is right about the time in the semester when a lot of students are getting homesick and a lot of parents are missing their students. But one of the reasons that we changed the academic calendar this fall is because we wanted to try to minimize the amount of travel. Anytime, in some ways, we've created a bit of a bubble here, right? And anytime that folks either come from the outside in, or folks from Calvin go to the outside and then return, we know that we jeopardize our ability to limit the exposure that happens. So we really are encouraging people to stay local. From the beginning of the year, we've asked people not to travel outside of the region to the extent possible. When they do travel, there's some great CDC guidelines about what to look for and how to minimize that risk when they get back. So for the most part, we're asking students to stay put. And we have a pretty rigorous visitor policy on campus this fall, which I know, again, is one of those things that kind of feels counterintuitive. It's not the Calvin that we all know and love, where we have open doors and love to welcome the community. So we are limiting the number of visitors on campus. In fact, nobody's allowed in campus buildings without a campus ID, or if they have the express invitation from a campus department and they've been cleared as an official visitor. So what that means for family members, if you were thinking about dropping by and visiting, it means that you'd likely have an opportunity to connect outside on campus, but we'll still have pretty stringent visitor policies. And we're encouraging students to stay here on campus to the extent possible. I ran into a parent in the community over the weekend, and it kind of warmed my heart. She said, "You would not believe how seriously my daughter is taking this. We live a mile from campus. I would consider us part of her pod, but she has not set foot home. She's not set foot at home even once in the last few weeks, that she is just, diehard not leaving campus, and says that that's a risk to her friends that she's come to know, and she doesn't want to do anything to jeopardize the experience." So we were really excited to hear stories like that, because I think it shows that the value our students are placing on this residential experience and really don't want to do anything to jeopardize that.
Yeah, for sure. We're asking our students to do hard things, and they are responding, and it's great to see. So let's talk a little bit about how this whole pandemic sort of changed things, and what things do you think we sort of learned going through this that we might even keep after we're all vaccinated and the pandemic's gone. And I know, even having these types of chats, we hadn't done them before, but it's great for our parents around the world to be able to sort of hear what's happening on campus. So I could see us doing something like this even after the pandemic's gone.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example, Rick. And that, in fact, is the first thing that typically comes to mind when I think about the silver linings, because in fact, you've heard us refer a few times that we see God's faithfulness in so many ways, big and small. And a couple years ago, as a member of the President's Cabinet, I was part of a strategic planning initiative. And one of the core goals that came out of that is that we really wanted Calvin University to be a place that had global impact. Now, we know that's true, but we also know that sometimes it can be a little West Michigan centric. And so I think there's been some really encouraging ways that, in some ways, being forced to live into a pandemic reality has actually helped us make progress on some of the areas that we had identified as things that we needed to build capacity in. So one of those things is the ability to connect in remote ways, right? To use online teaching and learning tools, to think about who we serve and how we serve them. So we have an international cohort of students who weren't able to make it back to campus this fall, but they too are having a first year learning experience away from this place. They're engaging with our faculty, they're engaging with fellow students, they're engaged in all of the things that our students here are in terms of faith development, community development, But that's something that 3 years ago we would never have dreamed we would get there that fast. So sometimes you look at those constraints and you figure out, how does God make something beautiful out of those constraints? So I would say that technological capability. Another example of that, this fall, or actually this summer, one of our favorite things is to welcome students to come to campus for orientation. Well, it became apparent to us in the spring that we wouldn't be able to host people on campus in large numbers. So we ended up doing a virtual summer orientation. And we had great reviews of that. Students appreciated the opportunity to get to know people in a remote way. And in fact, it was neat. I jumped on several of those calls, and to just have a group of students who were dialing from literally all over the world. That was really something encouraging. And I think that gives a picture of who we believe Calvin University is and where we see ourselves going in the future, is just continuing to expand who we serve and how we serve them. So I'd say that's one of the big glory stories of this time.
Yeah, for sure. I was able to join in on a couple of those parent sessions for orientation too, and met a parent online from Prague. And then when they were actually dropping their student off, I got to meet her in person. And so it was just fun to be able to have met already before, when they're bringing their student and dropping them off for the next years of education. So it's great. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what Calvin's done to be a good neighbor through all of this, and to help reach out to the Grand Rapids community a little bit.
Yeah, John serves as one of our liaisons with our local neighborhoods, and as well as with the police department. So John, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about some of the work we did to cultivate understanding and partnership with those two entities.
Yeah, we wrote a letter both to the Grand Rapids Police Department and then also to the neighborhood associations that are closest to campus that we regularly communicate with. And encourage them to send that letter out to the people living in those neighborhoods, where we basically thanked them for being sort of a neighborhood partner with us, and told them a little bit about what this fall was going to look like, and gave them some resources to talk to us if they're noticing anything concerning. We want our students to be good neighbors when they're living out in the communities around us. We want to be good neighbors to those folks. So one of the ways that we're a good neighbor is we're a place for local folks to come walk their dog, or walk with their spouse, with their family. And so we wanted them to be aware that we welcome that. We ask them to wear a mask if it gets congregated too tightly here, and recognize that that's what we're doing. Our buildings aren't actually open to the public right now, so we wanted them to be aware of that, but there's good reason for that. So we communicated this out and let them know that we take this work seriously, and we take their presence as our neighbors seriously. And I think that was well received by those folks. The police department appreciated our outreach to them too. They have a big job in this community with reduced resources as well. So, but we know that they're a key part in monitoring what's going on, and even sometimes noticing things that are outside of the norm for what would be safe in a COVID-shaped world. And we have not had any problems with that so far. So we're grateful for their partnership.
That's great. We are about out of time, but I know there's been so many positive things that have been happening through this, even though, I think a lot of the faculty and the staff are weary from all the planning that's been going on. But it is, like you said, Sarah, it's great to see God's faithfulness and the grace that's sort of been extended through all of this. I wonder if you could share a couple positive other things that have been happening on campus as a result of this, and also maybe some encouraging words to our parents, or maybe things that they might want to say to prospective students too.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned early on in the call, I have a lot of conversations with colleagues at other institutions, including some just, up the road, not too far from here. And it's apparent to me that Calvin, because of our size, because of I believe our faith mission, and our ability to love our neighbors well, I think Calvin's doing something pretty special here. I think that we are able to steward students in a way and able to steward the community in such a way that there's been great success. And I think that speaks pretty highly of our mission and of the team that we have. There's a couple of other little things that we're celebrating along the way that perhaps we didn't expect to be celebrating. And so one example of that is that our first to second year retention rate. So these are students who were first year students last year and then returned to Calvin this year. It's the highest it's been since we started tracking retention a number of years ago. And in particular, we made gains in some of the populations that we've been most focused on supporting and improving retention rates for. So first generation students, some of our night scholars, we call them. So we're rejoicing at those things because in the midst of a pandemic, when everything feels like it's different than what we anticipated, there's something about Calvin that keeps drawing these students back. And by God's grace, as a community, we're able to instill in them all of the things that make us happy to be part of this project. So really eager to see that continue. And yeah, eager for what that means in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much, John and Sarah. This has been a great discussion, and I feel like we're only scratching the surface of things that we could talk about today, but we'll be back with some more of these Calvin Chats. And we're all especially glad to have this conversation during Homecoming and Family Week to give parents a sort of a picture of what's happening on campus, especially when they can't visit this weekend. So, like I mentioned, we've got a, what's that?
I was just going to say thank you to the families. Your prayers are sustaining us, and the encouraging notes and calls, and even the calls that express concern or help raise issues that we can walk toward. All of those things make this the special place that it is. So I just want to express on behalf of President Leroy and the rest of the cabinet and all of my colleagues in student life, we're so grateful for you. Thanks for entrusting your children to us. They are amazing.
Yeah. It is. It is great to sort of see how well the Calvin students have been doing, especially when you hear other media reports of things that are not going as well on other college campuses. So I'm very grateful for the way our students have stepped up. So, and with Homecoming and Family Week this week, we are also going to be posting some photos from some student photographers on Facebook this week, so you can actually see on campus what's happening, what student life is like. And you don't have to just look into our offices from these video chats that we've been having. But we'll be posting some of those photos. And as I mentioned, we've got virtual activities that are going to be happening all week. So make sure you check out those opportunities online as well. We'll be hosting online trivia contests, one especially for families. So if your family, including your student, want to put a team together over Zoom or something along those lines, you can join us. We'd love to have you. And finally, watch our parent email newsletter and our Calvin Families page on Facebook for future Calvin Chats. I think we mentioned a couple ideas just on this one with Scott Vanderay for talking about dining, and perhaps Irene Kriegel from the Wellness Center. So there's a lot of great things that we can talk about and stories that we can tell from Calvin's campus. So thank you so much for joining us, John and Sarah. I know you guys are crazy busy right now, and I'm so grateful that you took some time out of the day to talk to parents. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Have a good day.
Bye.